Albert Einstein, Chapter 8, Proof at Last. Because Kaiser Wilhelm II wanted to establish for Germany the reputation of having the greatest scientists, the finest artists and workers, in fact, the best of everything, the German scientists were forced to give in to Albert Einstein's almost unheard of demands. It proved fortunate for him that they did. On his arrival in Berlin, he lectured to a group of outstanding scientists. He was aware of the fact that most of them didn't believe in his theory that gravity bent light, he told them, but he was prepared to show them a way to test his theory. He explained that when light passes near the sun, for example, it should be deflected by an amount which can be calculated. Therefore, when we see a star near the sun, it should appear slightly displaced from its normal position. But these stars are completely hidden from human sight because the glare of the sun obscures them. Only when the sun is hidden, as during an eclipse, would one be able to measure the displacement of these stars, and even then only with very accurate instruments. The expected displacement would be equal to 1.75 seconds of an arc. This is a tiny portion of a circle, about as big as the diameter of a penny would appear to be if the penny was seen from a distance of 2 miles. There was to be a total eclipse of the sun in August 1914, and this would be clearly visible from Russia. He therefore suggested that a group of scientists should go to Russia on that date to view the eclipse. Money was raised, expensive telescopes as well as cameras were purchased and packed, and a committee set out for Russia. The day they arrived at their destination, the First World War began. Russia joined forces with France and England against Germany. The Russians, not sharing Dr. Einstein's views about science being above all nationalistic borders, clapped all 4 of the German scientists in jail, where they remained till the end of the war. This, of course, was extremely hard on the 4 German scientists, but it also was hard on Albert, whose theory had to remain untested. There was little doubt now that Albert held the 3 most important jobs any scientist could hold. His prestige was enormous. The Kaiser and his staff felt that it was necessary to combat the many thirds of Germany's savagery by publicity about the great scientists and artisans who made their homes in Berlin. But Albert found it very lonely indeed. No one called him Albert anymore. It was Professor Einstein, or Herr Professor Einstein, or Herr Dr. Einstein. Albert began to wish for a few friends that would treat him with much less formality. This was in his mind when he decided to look up his cousin Elsa. He knew that she had married, that her husband had died leaving her with 2 daughters to bring up. He also remembered that his mother had always said that one day little Elsa would make a fine cook. He was amazed to find her a charming, gracious, gray-haired woman with a delightful home. He liked the 2 small daughters, Margot and Elsie. When they asked him to bring his violin next time he came to visit, he knew that this at last would be a real home for him. It was not long before the once famous Einstein evenings were resumed right in Berlin in the center of war-torn Germany. As in the old days in Monarch, everyone tried to get invitations to them. Soon, Elsa and Albert decided to marry. The other members of the family were delighted, for they felt that Elsa would make a home for Albert in which he could relax after a day's hard work. He loved her cooking and was glad that she was not particularly interested in his work. He talked enough about his work during the day. My interest in mathematics, Elsa said laughing, is confined strictly to the household accounts. For the second time in his life, Albert Einstein lived in an atmosphere that was a complete contrast to his surroundings. Berlin was the very heart of the war, Infantry troops grew stepped up and down the main avenues. Commands rang out at all hours of the day and night as guards were changed. There was a constant, almost deafening roar of the big guns aimed at far-off targets, and there was the growl of the anti-aircraft guns. Very infrequently there would be the wail of an air raid siren. These were rare indeed, for the English had their hands full defending London against the German bombers, and the Americans had not yet entered the war as allies of the British and French. The Allies had too few of planes to allow bombers to be risked on flights over the heavily defended German capital. In the midst of the sounds, sights, and smells of war, Albert Einstein and his wife Elsie lived quietly in their apartment. They spent evening after evening reading aloud from the works of Goethe, Heine, and Schiller, as Albert's father had once done in Munich so many years before. Albert Einstein was a citizen of Switzerland, and Switzerland was a neutral country that had refused to become involved in a world conflict. Thus, Albert could not be touched, even if there were some German patriots who felt that he should take a more active part in helping the German cause. He had only one answer to their criticism. He was a citizen of Switzerland. He had become a pacifist. He did not believe that might makes right. In 1917, when the war was still going full blast with indications that German military might and know-how might well prove superior to the combined armed forces of England, France, and Russia, there was a man in London who lived in utter scorn of the daily bombings of some of London's most beautiful old buildings and the tragic loss of English lives. Like Albert Einstein in Berlin, this man considered that scientific truth was of far greater importance than the conquering of one nation by another. This man was the astronomer royal of England. Ignoring falling debris and wailing air raid warnings, he attended a meeting to which he had summoned a small group of equally devoted scientists. He reminded them that a scientist named Einstein had suggested 3 years before that light was bent by the sun's gravitational pull, and that the only way this theory could be proved was by photography. The stars nearest the sun could be photographed at the time of a total eclipse of the sun. Such an eclipse, he said, was scheduled to take place 2 years hence in 1919. At that time, the obscure sun would be completely surrounded by a group of very bright stars, the Hyades. There are two places from either or both of which the eclipse could be both observed and photographed. One was a place in northern Brazil in South America. The other was an island in the Gulf of Guinea in West Africa. His listeners grew very excited. They must send expeditions to both places to test Einstein's theory of gravitation. No one expressed the natural doubt that these expeditions would be able to get past the German U-boats surrounding England. No one pointed out that England had been asked time and again to tighten its belt another notch because food was scarce and money practically non-existent. These men were scientists living in a world of their own, far removed from war and the everyday problems of everyday people. They decided to raise the money to send out the two expeditions so that photographs could be taken and observations made from both vantage points. In this way, if one expedition met with bad weather, in which the stars were not visible, the other expedition might have better luck. The Royal Society and the Royal Astronomical Society of England went about the business of raising the very large sum of money needed to finance these two expeditions. Unbelievably, they actually succeeded in raising this money and in purchasing the finest available telescopes and photographic equipment. Still, with no idea of how the parties were to get out of England in wartime with London under heavy daily bombardment. Suddenly, in November 1918, Germany was defeated. The war was over. Calmly, the two British expeditions set out early the following year. One headed by Sir Arthur Eddington, a noted English astronomer, headed for the island of Princeton in the Gulf of Guinea. the other for Sobral in northern Brazil. Both groups were successful in obtaining photographs. Whether or not these would prove or disprove Albert's theory that light was bent by 1.75 seconds of an arc out of its course would not be told until the photographs were compared with some taken in London at a time when the yays' distance from the sun was much greater. The new stars would no longer be exposed to the sun's gravitational power. Months passed, the photographs were studied. Astronomers discussed all possible errors and interpretations. Then on a day in November 1919, the scientists, mathematicians, and astronomers met by invitation in the chambers of the Royal Astronomical Society into a spellbound audience. The royal astronomer announced that the photographic plates had completely verified Einstein's prediction made more than 6 years before. The rays of light were bent as they passed close to the sun. They moved out of their course by 1.64 seconds of an arc instead of the 1.75 seconds predicted by the great Swiss scientist with only pencil and paper as his instruments. For the first time in 200 years, the finding of Isaac Newton had been challenged and had been found to need modification. Sir J. J. Thomson, president of the Royal Society, described Albert's theory of relativity as one of the greatest achievements in the history of human thought. It is the greatest discovery in connection with gravitation since first Newton enunciated his principles. Headlines that said in large black type, "Revolution in Science, Newtonian Principles Overthrown," normally would have attracted a great deal of attention. But these particular words happened to appear on the first Armistice Day, the anniversary of the end of World War I, and more readers were interested in looking at pictures of the ceremony, at the tomb of the unknown soldier, or in reading so-called human interest stories than in headlines that seemed to refer to something of interest only to scientists. No one in England had any idea that November 7, 1919, that those headlines would have a great meaning in another war more than 20 years later. But things were quite different in Berlin. There was no reason to celebrate the anniversary of Germany's final defeat, so the triumph of Albert Einstein was a cause for great joy. Reporters rushed to the apartment of the Einsteins, where Albert was discovered playing the violin for his wife and two small adopted daughters. The little scientist was shown copies of Sir Thomson's speech, as well as copies of the eclipse photographs. He realized that all the doubts that had been cast upon his theory, all the challenges to his integrity, all of these had been wiped out in one moment. He realized what this would mean to him and to his family. He could say nothing. He looked again and again at the photographs that had been handed him. "Wonderful," he exclaimed. "What wonderful, wonderful pictures." Albert and Elsa found themselves suddenly swamped in a tide of visitors. Some were scientists who came offering positions in other countries. Some were celebrity hunters who wanted the Einsteins to come to dinner so they could show them all to their friends. Some were inventors with strange ideas. Some were portrait painters, reporters, magazine writers, photographers. To Albert, who was always shy and self-effacing, it was torture. Elsa then took over. She decided that the family would be better off if they moved into a house outside of Berlin. She found a delightful cottage on the shores of a lake at Kapuf, some 20 miles out of town. The move did not discourage the long line of visitors. Strangers tramped through their lovely garden and even tapped on their window panes. Elsa made herself responsible for protecting her husband from those who were merely celebrity hunters. He continued his teaching at the three universities. In fact, he did more teaching and less experimentation than he had originally planned. He seemed to be a contented man, and yet there were moments when Elsa thought he was weary. However, she was completely unprepared for a scene, which took place one day in the spring. She was in front of the house using the pruning shears on the privet hedges lining the approach. At the same time, she was keeping her eye on her wristwatch to make sure that the young inventor she had sent back into the garden to see her husband would not overstay the time allowed him. Suddenly she heard Albert's voice raised in anger. "Get out!" he was shouting. "I want to hear no more about it. Get out!" Albert never raised his voice. He believed that only people who didn't know what they were talking about used loud voices, and that they did so to hide their lack of knowledge. What could be wrong? Elsa dropped the chairs as her husband and a young man appeared from around the back of the house. The postman and some children and older visitors were coming up the walk, so she was amazed to hear Albert continue his shouting without regard to anyone. "Don't argue with me. Don't try to tell me what can and cannot be done. I tell you no one will ever use my formula to make an explosive. It cannot be done." The young man with him surprisingly refused to be cowed, but continued expostulating and waving his hands. Only bits of what he said could be heard because of Albert's vehement denials. "I've only taken your formula as a springboard. It's all right here. If you only look at it, it's a natural outgrowth of E equal mc second." "No," Albert shouted. "It is not. No one will ever release the energy locked in the atom. It's purely theoretical." By this time, both men had reached the wall, and Elsa, dropping the pruning chairs, turned toward them. "What is it, Albert? What's wrong?" she asked. "Nothing's wrong, Lichman," he answered soothingly, but it was obvious that he was very much upset. She turned to the young man, who looked completely bewildered. "You better leave," she said. He nodded, still shaking his head as though trying to figure out what he had done to arouse the great scientist's anger. He walked down the path. Albert looked after him, the flush fading slowly from his cheeks as the newly arrived visitors waited politely to be greeted. He did not even notice them. For a moment, Albert looked at his wife. "He wanted my help in developing a bomb that would destroy the world," he said. Without saying any more, he went inside, leaving Elsa to ask the new arrivals to wait patiently for a little while. This strange little episode was never referred to again by anyone, although in later years Elsa had occasion to think of it many times. She found it strangely disturbing, for it seemed to indicate that her husband was under some kind of secret strain which he was not sharing with her or anyone else. From this time on, she noticed that he wanted to do less experimentation. He did not talk much about his famous formula, but became more and more eager to apply some of the truths he had learned to other fields. To the world in general, there was nothing strange about this, but to Elsa, who loved him and knew him so well, it seemed as if he were trying to avoid a discovery that would be too dangerous to handle.